Due to copyright laws and difficulties sharing the podcast across different platforms, the music unfortunately had to be removed from the original recordings. I hope this doesn't spoil your enjoyment or interrupts the flow too much.
You are an Ironman!
Born in 1973, I was the eldest child of three. My brother, sister and I were brought up in a council estate, Strathroy, in the garrison town of Omagh, by both parents. Our housing estate was located on the opposite side of a high security perimeter fence belonging to the British Army, who were stationed in the town's St Lucia barracks. My mum, God rest her, was a nurse, and Dad worked at the local shoe factory in the town when I came into the world on the 20th of August 1973. Dad went back to college to train as a teacher, and Mum was a nurse in the Tyrone County Hospital in Omagh at the time. Mum would work her shifts, and Dad would be away in Belfast during the week, living on the Falls Road in the height of the Troubles, attending St Mary's College. Times were tough, and money was scarce, and my parents did their best to better themselves and keep bread on the table. My sister came along in 1974, and my little brother arrived into the world in January 76. Our early years were largely spent in the local community in which we lived. We spent a lot of time being cared for by the neighbours and by our grandparents when our folks were away at college or at work. It was a different world then. I remember feeling afraid in the estate as a child when the army would drive through on patrols with soldiers poking up through the roofs of their Land Rovers, armed with guns and faces painted for war. I remember the noise of the helicopters coming and going at all hours of the night, and the roof of our terrace house shaking as the Chinooks passed above as they descended into the drop zone in the barracks, about 400 yards away. I don't know how those chimney pots survived for so long in that house. The 1980s saw the hunger strikes and escalating army presence in our nationalist housing estate. To put this into context, and to try and make it more vivid in your imagination, at 7 years old, we would have been outside playing hopscotch on the pavements while patrols of British soldiers walked the estate in full military battle gear, all carrying black machine guns. We were reared under threat. I remember at 11 years old singing festive carols outside the courthouse in Omagh in the lead up to Christmas. I think it was around 1984. There was about 35 of us boys at the time, all aged between 10 and 11. And we walked over to Galla's Hill, 10 miles away, and a bomb exploded in the town. We narrowly missed death that night, and by Christ we were scared. You see, outside of Ireland, the world only heard about the bombings when fatalities were reported on the news. The troubles rumbled on all the time. Omagh had been targeted many times throughout my childhood. I remember a bomb going off after our family had moved out of Strathroy. We all went upstairs to one of the bedrooms and looked out the window, watching the thick black smoke rising from the town centre, hoping and praying that none of our family or friends had been killed. Omagh, of course, would later become to the attention of the world in 1998 when the huge bomb devastated the town and the community, taking 29 lives and injuring hundreds. I don't think the town has been the same since, to be honest. Schooling in the 70s and 80s was no walk in the park either, I can tell you. Beaten by teachers for the most ridiculous things and feeling under scrutiny the whole time in class. I witnessed and received multiple physical reprimands during my early years at school, generally being hit on the palm of the hand by a bamboo cane or a black leather strap, and it hurt badly. I recall my primary 6 teacher was on yard duty and decided to punish the other primary 6 class for not lining up quickly enough at the end of the break. He lined the whole class up in front of our class and leathered each of those 35 boys, twice on each hand. We were terrified watching this. Those lads that were in that queue knew what they were in for, and for what. Our teacher at the time had hatred on his face as he tore into those boys, red-faced, panting and sweating from his brow as he neared the end of the queue. Crazy times. Of course, you didn't go home and tell your parents you got hit at school in case you got another clip round the ear for misbehaving. The punishment at school continued into grammar school, and it wouldn't be until I entered third year the corporal punishment ban would come into effect. I remember in second year at the Brothers turning round to the lad behind me and asking for a lend of Tipp-Ex. I noticed his facial expressions intensifying as he moved his head violently to the left. He was avoiding a wooden duster that the teacher had thrown at me. The duster narrowly missed the back of my head. It actually left a dent in the classroom wall. What a ridiculous thing for a teacher to do. Luckily none of us were seriously hurt, but I always reckoned that I would have ended up in hospital needing stitched if he had hit his intended target, and all because I turned round in my seat. On another occasion during second year, I remember the maths teacher asked me the answer to an algebra question, to which I replied 8. Teacher invited me up to the blackboard, he handed me the chalk and asked me to show how I'd worked that out. I just looked clueless at the equation and scribbled 8 after the equals sign. I didn't know how I arrived at the answer, but he suggested that I had looked at the answers at the back of the book, and I didn't. As I disputed his accusation, he placed his hand on my left shoulder. He forced his thumb downwards with great force behind my collarbone, crumpling me to the floor in agony. I stood holding my wounded shoulder with my right hand, my head buried in the right forearm to hide my tears from the rest of the boys in the class. You talk about being humiliated. That bastard took something from my soul that day, and I have never forgotten it. Powerlessness, under control, living in fear, social deprivation, physical abuse and emotional instability had left their marks on me, but it wouldn't be much until my adulthood that I would come to understand this and I would begin to fight back for myself. Back then I was forging a sense of myself based on my experiences and my environment, one of low self-worth, low self-esteem and even self-hate. I was the only child in school with a diagnosis of asthma back then, which also significantly impacted on how negatively I perceived myself, puffing on my inhalers and spending days at a time in the hospital during multiple admissions. In 1984, my parents had both secured steady income and we were moving up in the world. Leaving our terraced house in Strathroy, we found ourselves living in middle-class suburbia, and at the time this would be our permanent home until we would one by one leave the roost. We would leave behind friends in Strathroy, but we were quick to forge new friendships with a few lads on the Kelvin Road's private neighbourhood. These friendships were different, and I think it was largely due to the fact that we had such limited pool of kids to hang about with that our relationships became a lot tighter than the lads we had back in the Roy. We would play football in the streets, jump the ramps on our BMXs, climb trees and just jump off shit. I recently conversed with one of my old pals from the park and we talked about the mad stuff we used to get up to back then. In the world before mobile phones and the internet, we'd spend our days outside. And just down the road from us was a concrete manufacturer, and this was one of our playgrounds. Large lorry loads of sand were tipped into huge bins at the top of the industrial unit, and the gravel into another one. The gravel and sand would then fall down and get mixed on a conveyor belt that then mixed in cement and water, which filled the mixing lorries with their loads for the building sites. When the gravel bins overflowed, a heap of gravel would form on the ground below the towering structure. Of course, we didn't view this as just a pile of gravel. We saw a stunt. We figured out that if someone jumped from the top of that wall, they could break their fall if they landed on the loose pile of gravel. So yeah, that's what we did. Well, me and a couple of the other headers. We reckoned it was about 30 feet onto the 3-foot pile of gravel. But luckily we didn't break any legs. A little further away on a derelict ground lay the bones of an old garage with no roof, just the exterior walls remained. The walls rose from the back towards where the roller doors would have originally been situated. Nearby that was an old pile of sand. Again, this was assessed as a potential safety net to perform the next daredevil stunt. Of course I did it first. I ran along the 6-inch wide wall. As it rose, and leapt off the front edge like an Olympic long jumper, hitting the pile of sand right in the middle. Adrenaline-fueled madness, but sometimes climbing a horse chestnut tree just wasn't enough. Bikes were a strong feature in our childhood back in the 70s and 80s, and we were rarely off our bikes. We would ride all over the town on our bikes, while our folks just thought we were just round the corner. We'd seek out hills and bumps and curbs, gritty roads, and perform jumps and skids. On sunny days, we'd have wheelie competitions outside our house up the hill to the adjacent park. Bunny hops, wheelies, endos, ramps were all order of the day, all summer long. We were as fit as fiddles, lean and fearless. I remember making a one-brick ramp outside our house when we were just measuring how far we could jump off it. I think we were hitting about 18 feet off this wee ramp, hammering down the slight incline as fast as we could and ripping the BMX into the air with all our might. This was going superbly, and I was well in the lead as I went a bit further up the hill to go for the record, 20 foot. I remember pulling the handlebars off the ramp, flicking the back wheel off the sharp incline on the ramp and sailing through the air, except this time I kept rising. I had yanked the handlebars out of the front fork and landed at speed, standing up, holding the handlebars above my head. My front wheel hit the tar, bounced the frame upwards as I fell downwards onto the exposed steel tubular stem on the forks. I went into a forward roll, as I had done many times in an effort to save myself, and sat up winded and in shock. I thought to myself, how am I not dead? I stood up and assessed the damage, looking down my body, checking all the usual injury-prone protrusions. I noticed the circular oil mark just to the left of my groin. The fabric of my cheap grey tracksuit bottoms precisely sliced into a crescent shape. I feared the worst. My balls are cut. Thank God they weren't, but you talk about fear. I went as white as a sheet in shock, convinced that I had sustained unimaginable damage to the meat and veg section. I lay on the sofa like a wounded soldier to receive what I thought would be the last rites, only to be told, "You're grand, cub." My tackle was intact. My elbows and knees were bandaged, and after 10 minutes of a time-out and a glass of water, I went outside to fix the bike. It wasn't all doom and gloom. I have great memories of childhood too. It's just that the nasty shit seems to be more difficult to shift from your memory than the good times. Our summers back then were filled with action. We'd climb trees, go on cycles, we'd swim in the river during low water, scale lampposts, play ball. We'd climb up to the lampposts and then slide down them no-hander, or maybe climb up and do chin-ups on the arm that held the bulbs about 20 feet parallel to the pavement below. We had many trips to the beach, and I loved swimming in the sea. Jumping off the top step in Mullaghmore Harbour in County Sligo was a rite of passage that brought with it a sense of awesomeness. Of course I did that fairly quickly. Jumping off the top of Rogie Rock in Bundoran was next level, but of course I nailed it first time. I was very fortunate growing up in that I had known 4 grandparents and a great-grandmother. I spent a lot of time with them growing up, and they afforded me, my brother and sister, with a significant level of care when the folks weren't available to us through work and college. I lost all my grandparents within a very short period of time during my late teens and into my early adulthood, and it hurt a lot. I was unable to find comfort or support regarding these bereavements, so went straight to the solution of all our problems in Ireland: drink. Good old alcohol, the ever-present intergenerational staple. As a culture, us Irish have an affiliation for the drink. It's the reason we get together. For birthdays, celebrations, marriages, christenings, wakes, funerals. Drink is our go-to support mechanism, and we're largely oblivious to it as a race. If we're happy, have a drink. Sad, take a drink. Lonely, have a drink. Scared, take a drink. Any day of the week with the letter D is a good enough day for a drink. The biggest loss of all came in 2017 when I watched my mother take her last breath on a hospital bed. She had cared for me as best she could and nursed me throughout my asthmatic childhood, and I struggled to deal with her passing. Mum had been diagnosed with cancer 5 years previously, and this had given me a wake-up call, particularly since I had been advised that I too was carrying the gene for breast cancer in my DNA. Now, whilst I was obviously didn't have the female anatomy, I was less likely to develop breast cancer. But the notion that wee fucker was in me was enough for me to want to make changes. I needed to lose weight, I needed to get rid of the moobs, and I needed to get more active. I joined Oma Triathlon Club in the winter of 2015 and made an effort until Mum's passing, which threw me off course, as you can imagine. Mum, in her death, had taught me her final lesson. If I don't change anything about my lifestyle, this is how it might end for me too. I don't want to die at 68 years old in pain. I mean, who does? I realised that my death will also be devastating to my boys, and I realised that I could perhaps put my own death off for a few years if I got my shit together. So that's what I did. No more self-hate. No more playing to the crowd. Time to protect myself so that I can protect my family. A fire had been lit under my sorry ass, and it has remained burning since Mum's passing. I've never let it get out in my mother's memory, and it keeps me going now each and every day. The fragility of life has made me think. It shouldn't be rest in peace. It should be live in peace. Find peace within yourself and live your life rather than just existing in a self-sabotaging, dreadful Groundhog Day. By the time I had reached early adulthood, I had already let myself go due to poor choices, bad habits, low self-worth and a self-defeatist attitude, drifting from one job to the next, from one pub to the next, from one rock concert to the next. I was overweight, out of shape and out of breath from smoking cigarettes and living each day without any idea of what to do or where I was going. Listening to Iron Maiden with a bag of beer and 20-pack of Regal filters was my comfort blanket. This was all I knew at the time, and I couldn't see how I was limiting my existence. How come I ended up like this? I suppose it was the area in which I was reared, although not all entirely responsible, but certainly significantly influential. Back in the late 70s and through the 80s, it was perfectly normal to gather at a house, armed with booze and smokes, to drink and chat into the wee hours. Money was hard to come by, and the house party was an affordable alternative to going out in the town. I'd seen many parties in our house growing up. If my folks weren't at someone else's house having the crack, then the party was in ours. I remember the house being full of people, and us being sent upstairs to bed. Sleeping wasn't possible due to the laughing and the music and the banter from downstairs, and the coming and going of people in and out of the bathroom, the flushing of the toilet, the creaking of the floorboards on the lantern, the smell of smoke travelling up the stairs, and all to the tunes of Jimi Hendrix, Queen, Horselips, from the big stereo system directly below our bedroom. I guess it was there that I was predisposed to go down the rock and heavy metal route with regards to the music I would later identify with as a teenager. It was in third year in the Brothers that I discovered Iron Maiden. Game changer. I now had a music that represented my inner thoughts. It was raw, angry, fast, aggressive. I related to it straight away. This music was unlike anything I'd ever heard before. It moved me differently than that old bubblegum nonsense that was being pumped out across the airwaves at the time. I remember feeling intrigued by the tones of the guitars, amazed at the operatic singing prowess of Bruce Dickinson, and astounded at the sharp, piercing shrills and the melodic, adventurous guitar solos. Safe to say I was hooked straight away. Soon I would add Peace of Mind, Iron Maiden, Master of Puppets to my embryonic metal collection as I evolved into a metalhead over the next few years. Smoking was an almost inevitable rite of passage back in the day, and as a kid living on the edge, I was straight into that shit. Whatever I could get at the time. And when I had no access to cigarettes, I would stand around the older lads and wait for one of them to leave me a butt to smoke. I can recall how we would congregate outside mobile classrooms just at the perimeter of the school grounds for a cigarette. Sometimes the teachers would join us for a smoke or even a mooch a cigarette off some of the 7th years if they had none themselves. The inhalers took a back seat. The Regal filters became my primary asthma treatment as the hair grew wilder and longer over time. I remember my brother and I piercing our ears one night at home when the folks were boozing across the road to the neighbour's house. We didn't give a shit. Much to our surprise, the folks didn't really pick up or kick up too much of a fuss about our earrings either. I guess the damage was done, and it was very common for lads to wear an earring back then. We wore plain studs for a long time, but we moved then on to those cheap dangly ones with skulls or spiders and daggers. The shit that we would purchase at the local market. I pierced my ear a second time, wore 2 earrings for many years, usually a stud and a dangler. The stud would often be substituted for an inverted cross if I was going to a gig for maximum metalness and shock value, of course. We used to hang out at the hut after school and at the weekends. And the hut was our own clubhouse, I suppose. It was a simple but effective shelter, and we would hang out there and talk shite for hours at a time. The hut was built between 2 fees, straddling a stream that separated the fields at about 4 feet below the field level. We put pallets down into the stream to act as a floor and to allow the water to flow through. We dug out one bank and fashioned it into a bench, which we draped in old carpet, and we had an old tin roof that we put from one field across to the other field overhead as a roof. We had one side boarded up and the other side half boarded so we could get in and out, and it was all accessed by a homemade ladder onto a wee pallet landing area. In the tree we had a rope hanging, and we would use it to swing from one field over to the next stream, like Tarzan. Thinking about it now, it was pretty cool. As we hit 15 to 17 years old, we would all meet at the hut, smoke cigarettes and drink cheap beer, and talk about how we would tour the world when we were all rock stars. This became our norm. We fell into this routine. We would scrape together what cash we had and buy as many cans of cheap beer and single cigarettes as we could. We were listening to Guns N' Roses, AC/DC, Iron Maiden and Metallica at the time. We loved the idea of the rock and roll lifestyle. We tried our best to emulate this as often as possible. We didn't do the drugs bit, but we did the drink bit. It wasn't long before we decided we should form a band, and so Savage became a thing. When I think back, the name Savage was perfect for us, because not only did it express our primitive angst against the world, but it also described our musical talent. We were shite. We played a few gigs in Oma, and we were generally recognised as the Spinal Tap of Oma due to the humour really that we injected into our lyrics, and the fact that we never really took ourselves too seriously. We would practice in our garage in our quiet suburban cul-de-sac, much to the annoyance of the neighbours. I remember my mother interrupting us during Am I Evil to share that she had just received a phone call from the lady across the road who requested that we turn the drums down. My brother, nicknamed Suede, beat the hell out of his drums in response, as you can imagine. We were somehow invited to participate in a music contest that was being judged by local radio celebs. We thought this was great, so we agreed to do it. Savage and another local metal band, Sanitarium, would rock up to this talent show and give the judges something to talk about, and of course we didn't disappoint. The gig was in Knocknamoe Castle in Oma, long since gone now. The dance hall had a large stage standing about 5 feet high, and the hall was kitted out with laser lights and spotlights. We thought this was fantastic, and we felt like rock stars with all the mod cons we would usually associate with Iron Maiden rather than Savage. Savage always had trouble recruiting a singer. I think we had a different singer at every gig, and when I say singer, I'm using that term loosely. Rod was out front that day, armed with the lyrics scribbled down on sheets of A4 which he held in his hand at the mic. Real professional. Suede was on drums, and curious about a pedal that was sitting on the floor to the left of his bass drum pedal. Holding it down with his foot, his curiosity was answered when he realised it was a smoke machine. The stage was engulfed with smoke as we started to play Offie, which was a song we penned about teenage drinking. Rod, still standing in front of the microphone, shouted, "For fuck's sake, Suede, what are you at? I can't read the fucking lyrics, you bollocks, ye." This would be heard by everybody in the hall, much to the judge's horror. As the smoke dispersed, it revealed a bunch of lads headbanging and thrashing around to our tune, a real standout memory from what would be our last gig. The band would eventually die out as we got closer to adulthood and the lads went off to college and university, but the love of music would live on in our Walkmans and in our hearts. Fast forward to the early 90s. It's no surprise that I'm all out in self-destruction. I don't give a shit about myself. Partying, drinking, smoking, rocking out, staying out, passing out, sofa surfing, living on the edge. Rock and roll. Our whole lives revolved around booze and music. That's all we knew. We had been well schooled in this way of living and we were young and reckless. My washboard six-pack stomach soon faded to give way to the beer belly. I mean, why have a six-pack if you can have a keg, right? Double chin, triple chin more like. I was driving at this age, so exercise slipped to the wayside too, with the exception of staggering home from a night on the lash. Every weekend was the same. I'd get collected at home about 6:30, pick up a few of the lads, hit the off-licence, back to Paul's house for pre-drinks and smokes. Initially this would be about 4 or 6 cans of beer before we'd get a taxi to the pub. Over time this would become 12 cans and a quarter bottle of gin each. We got ourselves into some states. Friday nights and Saturday nights were just all out alcohol-fueled madness. We would hit a local nightclub for the last hour or so and then go back to Paul's house and polish off whatever we could find to eat in his parents' freezer from the supplies that they had left him for the weekend, while they stayed in their mobile. Some nights I'd stagger home, some nights I'd be too drunk to go anywhere and would just flake out on a sofa. The trouble was we didn't know any better. This was our norm. We were primed to be boozers and we gave it large, to use the lingo of the 90s lads culture. I didn't finish university, as I couldn't be bothered with it. I hated it. The only good thing that came out of it was the student loans, which were inevitably spent on beer and smokes. I dropped out, took up a shitty wee job and began to drift. I was on my self-fulfilling prophecy, full tilt, and I was blind to the abuse that I was subjecting myself to. Being out with the lads on the rip was all that mattered in the 90s. Even when I got attacked outside a bar in the town, it left me unconscious on the street with a broken jaw. I didn't see the harm or risk that I was inflicting on myself during this period. It was just my norm. Family life eventually quietened me down, and my social life dwindled into non-existence except for the occasional concert once or twice a year. We had some mighty crack at various gigs over there. Seeing Iron Maiden, Metallica, Guns N' Roses, Anthrax, Slayer, Megadeth, Aerosmith, Rage Against the Machine, many more. I always enjoyed the bus trips to the gigs, sometimes even more than the gig itself. I think it was the company, that feel-good factor with like-minded people, and the conversation on the bus that floated my boat so much. Guns N' Roses and Slain 1992 was an epic bus trip. So too was the return leg in 2017. Me and a good mate, D. Campbell, I'm sure you know him, we had golden circle tickets for that one, and it was a great day out. On such days I would be full of energy and childish enthusiasm. I would be having the time of my life during concerts, but I would die a death on the way home. I would typically be seen retching into an Asda bag for life on the back seat on the way home. And that's a long spin from Slain when you're as sick as a dog, with D. Campbell dropping Smithix-fueled methane bombs at every bump on the road. I've seen the mighty Iron Maiden 3 or 4 times over the years. I've seen Metallica 4 or 5 times. I've been to many concert venues from a teenager, north and south of Ireland, travelling as far down as Tipperary to the legendary Trip to Tip in 1992. That was some weekend. I haven't been to a concert now since Metallica headlined Slain in 2019. Since I decided to quit the beer in 2020, I just don't feel that I need or want to do that anymore. I've kind of been there, done that, bought the t-shirts. Going out and not drinking was unheard of whenever I was a young man. If you ever, and I never, said you were not drinking, the first question in response to this was, why not? What's wrong with you? It's actually mad to think that back then, if someone decided they weren't going to poison their system with booze, that this would be met with such a response. But that was the culture. That's what everybody did. And if you didn't, you were a weirdo, or there was something wrong with you. I was a lost soul, a sheep, following the drunken herd, blindly being led deeper and deeper down the road of self-destruct, and there was no sign of a shepherd to steer me towards healthier pastures. Truly wasted years.